Welcome to day 2 of our experience in online technology and learning. Today, we're going to continue the discussion that we were having last class, where we were thinking about what makes a virtue ethic distinctive. You'll remember that last time we were looking at Rosalind Hursthouse's theory, and Hursthouse's theory offered us an account of how we might get a distinctive story about virtue ethics whereby virtue ethics has its own kind of structure. You'll remember that she offered an account of the structure of deontology, according to which an action is right if and only if it's in accordance with a moral rule or principle. And then she went on to describe the moral rule as one laid on us by God, if you're a divine command theorist, or one that's required by natural law, or is laid on us by reason, or that would be the object of rational choice. Each of these draws a tight connection between the concept of right action and a moral rule, and then explains what a moral rule is by connecting the concept of a moral rule to the concept of rationality or of a divine command. Similarly, when it comes to consequentialist theories, you have an opening claim that says an action is right if and only if it promotes the best consequences. And then what's distinctive about the act utilitarian version is that it spells out what the best consequences are in terms of the happiness of those who might be affected. So the first premise forges a conceptual link between right action and best consequences, and the second premise forges a conceptual link between best consequences and maximal happiness. Similarly, she proposed a story about the structure of virtue ethics. Here we have a subordinate premise to go with premise 1, but the opening move is to say an action is right if and only if it is what the virtuous agent would do in the circumstances. And then you spell out who the virtuous agent is, namely one who acts virtuously, that is, one who has and exercises the virtues. And then you fill in the nature of the virtues by explaining that a virtue is a character trait a human being needs to flourish or to live well. So the first premise forges a conceptual link between right action and a virtuous agent. The second bit of that premise forges a connection between a virtuous agent and the virtues. And finally, the second premise forges a conceptual link between virtue and flourishing. But you'll remember that we raised a worry at the end of last lecture. A worry not that she hadn't laid out a kind of virtue ethic, but rather a worry as to whether the way that she'd characterized the different kinds of theories drew the lines in the right places. Why might we worry about that? Well, one reason we might worry about it is if we look at the structure of deontology once again. And we can notice that a consequentialist of a rule variety could end up satisfying the conditions that she lays out for a deontological theory. However, no deontologist is going to endorse the claim that a rule consequentialist is a deontologist. And no rule consequentialist is going to endorse the claim that a rule consequentialist is a deontologist. Ask Tim Mulgan, he won't tell you he's a deontologist. He'll tell you that he's a consequentialist. So that suggests that at least in the characterization of deontology, we need a different story about what distinguishes a deontological theory. Similarly, when it comes to thinking about virtue ethical theory, you'll remember that we noticed that you could endorse premise 1 and premise 2, which seem to be the premises that set the frame for a distinctive kind of theory for the deontologist and for the consequentialist, as Hursthouse understands it. So you can have someone who endorses the opening premise of the virtue ethical schema she's given us, but is once again not offering a virtue ethical theory. The virtue consequentialist can endorse the opening claim that an action is right if and only if it's what the virtuous agent would do in the circumstances, and could also agree that a virtuous agent is one who acts virtuously, that is, one who has and who exercises the virtues. Julia Driver would be happy with both of those claims, but she will part ways with Hursthouse in offering a different second premise, suggesting that a virtue is a character trait whose possession generally produces good consequences. That, once again, suggests that we may not have drawn the lines in quite the right place to help us distinguish consequentialist theories from either deontological theories or from virtue ethical theories. Furthermore, I noted last time that the opening premise, an action is right if and only if it's what the virtuous agent would do in the circumstances, gives us a distinctive kind of virtue ethical theory, a theory that is built around a qualified agent whose judgments and behaviors we then defer to. But a number of theorists haven't endorsed this kind of story. People like Christine Swanton will resist the qualified agent theory. And so if we want to offer an account of what's distinctive about virtue ethics, what it is that allows a virtue ethical theory to be a different kind of theory than a consequentialist one or a deontological one, we're still looking for a different answer, because the account that we got from Hursthouse includes things that we don't want to include as instances either of deontology or virtue ethics, and it excludes a number of theories whose advocates do consider themselves virtue ethicists, people like Christine Swanton. So how might we come up with a different schema that helps us identify what counts as a virtue ethic and what might count as a different kind of theory? Well, to get our bearings on this, I want to borrow from Linda Zagzebski, who offers a following characterization of what we might look at when we're interested in things that matter to us in a normative theory. So we could look at concepts like good and bad, or better and worse. Alternately, we might be interested in concepts like right or wrong, or duty. Finally, we might be interested in concepts like virtue and vice, or wise and foolish. What groups the concepts in this third category together is that they seem to have a focus on character. What groups those in the second category together is that they're concerned with obligations. And the first category is concerned with value. We might simplify the story, and it's admittedly an oversimplification, but we might simplify it in the following way, thinking that one subfield is interested in good, another in should, and the final one in what is praiseworthy. Now, we can notice that these three categories of normative interest line up with recognizable subfields in moral thought. The first of these is the area known as axiology. The second is going to be deontology, and the third will be virtue theory. Okay, so what then is going to be distinctive about the theories that we're interested in? Well, it won't just be that that they talk about value or about obligation or about character, because as you'll remember on the opening day of class, I pointed out that all kinds of normative theory need to say something about each of those things. Everybody needs to say something about obligations, about goods and bads, and about character. So what distinguishes them is going to be the relations that they forge between these different notions. So that's the idea, the forming of the conceptual link that Hursthouse is talking about, that we're going to push forward to see if we can find a way of telling the story so that we get a distinctive account that is a virtue ethical account. So let's look at deontological ethics. What's interesting about deontological ethics is that they start with the idea of obligations. And then they explain what has value in terms of obligations. And they explain what virtue and vice consist in terms of obligations. So let's just look at the second relationship, the one between obligation and character. There are a number of theorists who, like William Frankena, define virtue in terms of obligation. A virtue, Frankena says, is a tendency, quote, to do what is morally right. What does all of the explanatory work, the thing that is foundational conceptually to the account of virtue that Frankena puts forward, is the notion of what is morally right. So at the foundation of the theory, we have rightness, and we explain other important normative concepts in terms of their relationship to rightness. Franken is not alone in developing a theory like this. A number of people suggest that to be moral is to do one's duty or to follow the moral rules, and then they define a virtue as something that enables one to do so more reliably. For instance, John Rawls offers the following characterization. Virtues are, quote, strong and normally effective desires to act on the basic principle of right. Rightness in Rawls' story is doing the heavy lifting in helping us identify what counts as virtuous. Or Ellen Gevirth, a decade and a bit later, says a virtue is a tendency, quote, to act as moral rules direct. Or fast forward yet another decade, we have Bernard Gert advancing the following claim. Moral virtue, in general, involves justifiably following the moral rules and ideals significantly more often than most people do. Moral vice involves acting contrary to the guide provided by morality significantly more often than most people do. What we get out of each of those theories, as well as Franken's, is a way of understanding what a virtue is, but that way of understanding defines a virtue in terms of rightness. So you need to understand what rightness is before you can understand what virtue is. Now, around the same time that Hursthouse was writing the paper that you've just read, and that Gary Watson was writing the paper that you were reading for today, Jorge Garcia was also writing his paper, which came out in the same year that Watson's did and the year before Hursthouse's. He pushes back against characterizations of virtue that define it in terms of rightness, and offers 4 reasons for being dissatisfied with virtue deontology. The first is built around the observation that a benevolent person will have some inclination to help others, even when she's not directed or required to do so by the moral rules. Even if she's not under an obligation to help another person, a benevolent person might see that they're in need and reach out and assist them, not because they have a right to this kind of treatment or to fail to offer them this assistance would be a moral failing, but because the benevolent person is compassionate, is concerned for the welfare of others and wants to promote it when she has opportunity. A second complaint that Garcia raises against virtue deontologists is that a benevolent person will be inclined to want and hope that others prosper, even when she realizes she cannot by her actions help them. I can be reading about the current pandemic in Italy and wish that there was something I could do to help the various people who are in hospital in Italy struggling for their lives. Nevertheless, I don't have medical expertise, nor do I have the causal ability to alleviate their suffering and return them to health. So I can desire and wish and hope, but I can't act. Insofar as a virtue deontologist, like, say, Frankena, is defining what's distinctive about the virtues in terms of people who act rightly, then he's not going to be able to explain what this distinctive feature of the benevolent person is, because they're not acting. A third objection that Garcia raises is that a benevolent person, quote, will be inclined to be pleased with others' good fortune and displeased with their bad fortune. Once again, it's about their inner emotional states, not about their actions. Someone like Rawls might make better headway in respect to this concern than someone like Frankena or Gevirth. Nevertheless, Garcia thinks that even Rawls' story isn't going to be adequate to capture the full range of benevolence. Why? Well, the virtue of benevolence cannot be simply a disposition to action because it consists not in action, but in various forms of mental response which may or may not be expressed in action. On the story that we got from Rawls, as you'll remember, virtues are strong and normally effective desires to act on the basic principle of right. But my desire may not be a desire to act because I recognize I can't act. Perhaps What I'm interested in isn't just physically distant from me, maybe it's historically distant. The benevolent person is going to be concerned about the welfare even of historical individuals, such that when they hear their plight, they feel a certain way. But that feeling isn't tied up with a confusion on their part, such that they desire to act, because they recognize that these things are already done and dusted. There's no causal intervention that would be possible for them. Okay, so we have 4 reasons for thinking that to define a virtue in terms of right action or a desire to act rightly is going to be inadequate to characterize just one of the virtues that we might be interested in. We can duplicate those concerns with a range of other virtues. That suggests that the deontologist is going to have difficulty accounting for the nature of virtue, at least as commonly understood. Let's turn now to the relationship that's distinctive about consequentialist theories, because what they do is reverse the arrows. Instead of values being defined in terms of obligations, obligations will be defined in terms of values. The obligations we have, the things that are right or wrong, are going to be the things, the actions in the case of act consequentialism that will produce the best outcomes, or the rules in the case of rule consequentialism, whose observation will generally lead to the best outcome. And an act or rule consequentialist will then define a trait of character as a desirable trait of character, a virtuous trait of character, insofar as that trait of character is going to bring about those good outcomes. What a character consequentialist does is they just change one of the arrows. So as with the act or rule consequentialist, they think that goodness or badness of character will be defined in terms of goodness or badness of states of affairs, but our obligations won't be defined directly in terms of what our actions produce, the outcomes, that is, of our actions, but rather what's right or wrong will be determined by the traits of character whose possession generally will lead to the best outcomes. So someone like Julia Driver can tell us that we ought to do what benevolence dictates, or we ought to do what justice dictates, etc., or some combination of the various virtues and the tensions between them that finally gets ironed out by something like practical wisdom. On Driver's account, what makes each of those traits a virtue is that its possession generally produces good consequences, and then a right action will be defined in terms of people acting in accordance with those virtues. But you'll remember way back at the beginning of the semester when we looked at utilitarianism and the virtues, Philippa Foot gave us reason to be dissatisfied with the consequentialist story, whether it's in its character consequentialist guise or its act or rule guise. Any of the 3 runs into a difficulty, she argued. The difficulty was, you'll remember, that the idea of maximum welfare, or the idea of the best outcome, or the idea of a good state of affairs, does not stand outside morality as its foundation and arbiter, but rather, she claims, it appears within morality as the end of one of the virtues, namely the virtue of benevolence. So you can't identify what a good outcome is, or what a good state of affairs is, or what maximum welfare is, until you've already adopted the standpoint of benevolence. That means that in order to pay attention to any of these kinds of qualities, welfare, good outcomes, good states of affairs, we already need to have an appeal to the virtues. That then leads us to the 3rd kind of theory, namely a virtue ethical theory, one in which obligations get explained in terms of virtues and value gets explained in terms of virtues. What's distinctive then about this kind of story, Gary Watson suggests, is that an ethics of virtue claims the concept of virtue is in some way theoretically dominant. That's what's going to tie together the various varieties of virtue ethic, and is what is going to distinguish them from consequentialist theories on the one hand and deontological theories on the other hand. what they do is they each explain the other terms, the obligation terms like rightness and wrongness or duty, and the goods and bads, the value terms like good states of affairs or good outcomes, in terms of something that appeals to the virtues. I'm going to stop this bit of our lecture there and invite you to spend some time thinking about whether or not you're satisfied with the kind of schema that we've just been talking about. Is it the case that that schema is going to avoid the problems that Hurst-House's theory was beset with? And if so, is it going to avoid other objections that you might imagine could be raised against it? I'll pick up from there in the next bit of today's lecture. See you again in just a moment.